Welcome back, everybody. Today, I'm dressed as my best straight boy because we're talking about growing up gay in a conservative place. First of all, I should probably caveat this by saying, um, I didn't really grow up gay because I didn't know I was gay until I was like 18 or 19 years old. So, my entire experience of gay was from the perspective of like a little straight boy because that's what I thought I was. And I genuinely had no interest in guys until I was much, much older. Um, so I didn't grow up, I grew up thinking I was weird and unusual and strange, but none of that was tied to like my sexuality. So just that's like little caveat. But that being said, um, growing up in a conservative place, like I had my perceptions of what being gay meant when I was like first introduced to it. It was like later in my growing up. Like I didn't know what gay was until I was probably 13 or 14 and I moved to like a middle school in town because I was in like little county schools and that kind of stuff was just never talked about. Like there was never a kid in any of my classes who I thought was gay. I didn't know what gay meant. So it wasn't until I was like 13 or 14 that kind of like the entire concept of being queer or being like homosexual, that's when that kind of like started for me. But I had like a very interesting upbringing in terms of like that kind of stuff. Like no one in my family's gay. So like it was never talked about at the dinner table. Um, my parents are very much like that's like a private thing. So like they were at least, and so they like never brought it up. There was never any discussion of it. We never saw it on the TV stuff we watched. Like we watched like very like controlled cartoons that were like approved. um and like don't get me wrong, like my parents aren't socially conservative. Like they're not people who ever like had a problem with people being gay. They just thought like, why should anybody else have an opinion on someone's sexuality when sexuality is this private, personal thing? Um, and even my grandparents felt that too. Like my grandparents had the same view. Like that's none of our business, Like we have no right to like judge or see people differently based on something that is their private, personal thing. However, in middle school, I was very rudely awakened to the whole concept of being gay. And my first experience with being gay was people bullying other people and being like, "You're gay, like that's so gay, like you're gay." Um, and like it wasn't often used against me. And like when it was kind of like, oh, like cool. Like it wasn't like I was like repressing it or like really like hating it or anything, but it was used as an insult. And so then like I equated being gay as like, oh, that's bad because, people are using it as like an insult. And so that like that was like my first experience with the whole idea of like gay or being gay. Um, and then like I encountered some people who were gay, and one of them was actually like my high school bully. He was gay and was like really up in my face about it, and like he asked if I was gay and I was like, no, I don't think so, like no. um and he was like, from then on, like he bullied me, and so like that also kind of confused my whole concept of like being gay because I had this like bully who was like just a jerk, like just a jerk, not because he was gay, but like that was one of the things that I associated him in my mind. And so that didn't like help my perception either. Um, and so yeah, that was kind of difficult. And then when you grow up in like a conservative place and you grow up in like a conservative area with rural people, um, that whole queer identity is very different than if you're in a city. Like if you're in the middle of a city or like on the gay street of the city where the pride like parade goes, um, you're gonna have a very different perception of being queer. You're gonna be able to be a lot more open if you choose. But in a rural setting, like you really don't have that option. You do not have like that ability because when you come out, you're it. Like that's it. Like you don't have a community behind you. You don't have a support system. And the people that support you quietly. They don't support you like overtly. And that's a real problem because if you're like a young gay kid and you're growing up like on a farm or in a small town, you feel like an island. Like you must not be able to really like express yourself. You're having to hide it. You're associating being queer with being bad because you're being bullied. You're told in church that it's like a sin. So I think like no wonder that we have to deal with like higher rates of, self and all kinds of stuff like that. Like there are all kinds of repercussions to being in that isolated island of like no support. So, yeah, I think like part of me really does think that I like dodged a bullet not having to grow up in my queer identity and only discovering it after I became like an independent, fully actualized young adult. Like I was literally like 19 years old when I was like, you know what, maybe I am gay. And at that point I could drive. I was more or less financially independent. I knew my family was going to support me regardless. Like I had a lot of incredibly good things going for me when I realized my queer identity. And so many young people don't get that opportunity, especially if you're living in a conservative or rural place. And it's really sad and it's really frustrating that even today there are hate crimes, there are all kinds of violence towards LGBT people, there are, there's the looming threat of legislation being passed in all jurisdictions that can limit or, take away freedoms that we once had, the idea of the Supreme Court of the US overturning constitutional gay marriage, that's like an ever present threat. And, some people will be like, no, it's not. But if you look at the way the justices are stacked currently and the ideology of like Justice Coney Barrett or, you know, all of these people, it's really not out of the realm of possibility that those kinds of things can be happening. And in addition, there are over 60 countries on this earth today that will unalive you just for loving the same gender that you are. So there's a lot of conservative places in the world. And even though online has become, a very safe place to be in many ways, there are huge areas of, Canada, the US, England, these developed countries, there are huge areas where being queer is quite dangerous and it's not safe to express your identity. And I think for me, growing up in a conservative place really, hid my queer identity. The things that I encountered being queer were all negative. And so even if I had the ability to discover who I was at an earlier age, that would have been just detrimental to me. That wouldn't have been a good thing, like now I know like I am queer, I am bisexual, I am gay, like whatever label you want to ascribe to it. But if I had known that at like 13 years old and just thought that something was wrong with me, and then the society and the conservative place that I was in confirmed and helped affirm that entire ideology, that's a real problem. That is a real issue because what would I have done? Like that would have led to a lot of like self-hatred and, all kinds of the issues that you see in queer spaces. So yeah, it's really frustrating. It's really sad. I think rural people, and especially rural queer people like myself, like I live on a farm in a rural area. Um, I do think like now that I'm an independent human being, there is like a responsibility to ensure that people know that it's safe out here. Like that's what I want. Like the country and the rural place that I live in is absolutely gorgeous. It's a beautiful place and everybody deserves to have like a right to come and be in this space. I hate this idea that like and there is like this stereotype that like farmers hate like tourists. They hate people like coming to, city people coming to the country and, mess it up and then leave. Like there's like this stereotype that like farmers are pretty xenophobic, and like it's true, But I think it's like a queer responsibility to try and like make the country a safer place, you know, make the rural areas more understanding, because like when people out here find out that like, oh, like, you know, Jax has like a boyfriend or like whatever, like I don't right now, but if I did, it would send a message to these people that, you know, like everyone can have a piece of the country. Everyone can have a rural existence if they want one. And like to be fair, a lot of queer people don't want one because they have been um, sort of chased out of the rural areas with pitchforks. And that's a shame. And then they've had to congregate in cities where they can create these safe places. And that's why these places exist. You know, these queer spaces in cities really only exist because rural conservative areas have chased all of these people out and made them feel ostracized and not worthy. So they're just going to create spaces themselves. And that's great. It's great to have a space, but it's sad that that is the cause of, that's the reason why we have these spaces. So yeah, I don't know. Growing up in a conservative place, like it gives you a certain set of values. I honestly believe it gives you a certain work ethic. It makes you see the world in a very, I don't know, it makes you see the world in a very linear place, because really like I do see people even today, like I separate people in my brain between city people and country people, because I think that's like one of the biggest distinctions of people you meet. Um, and it's really funny. Like I will do that when I meet someone really quickly. I'll be like, ah, like city person, like very, because city people have a very specific way of looking at the world, whereas like a country person sees very different things. Um, and so like for example, like a city person might look at a forest and be like, oh, like that's pretty. Whereas a country person might look at it and be like, oh, you know, those birch trees are looking pretty good, you know? Or like they'll look at it and be like, oh, that's a good spot for deer hunting. Um, and so like, you know, city people and country people see different things when they look at the world because of how they grew up. And I think that's interesting. And it's interesting, especially when you throw the whole queer identity thing on top, because I don't know, I see things very differently. Like I can sympathize and I can agree with a lot of my LGBT friends on certain issues, but when it comes to like issues concerning the country or wildlife conservation or farming or any of this stuff, I generally have a very different view than my city friends. And usually I get like very opinionated to my city friends because I don't want somebody who has no knowledge of this stuff giving their opinion on an issue when like I know more than you. Like I'm not trying to be like um pig-headed or like arrogant, but you know, when a city person tries to tell me that, you know, deer hunting is like this awful horrible thing, and I have all the facts about like conservation and wildlife management and like how my family uses every part of the animal, I'm just like, no, I know more than you. Stop. Your opinion is invalid. I'm sorry, but just because you watched Bambi doesn't mean, you know, you have the moral authority on this issue that you've never experienced yourself. Um, anyway, that's a little off topic, but I'm kind of famous for that, so whatever. But yeah, so queer identity in rural spaces. I'd really like to hear your comments and your opinions. You know, if you grew up in a rural or a conservative space and then had to deal with your queer identity, I would love to hear about it. I hope it was a good experience. I imagine that there are some pretty heartbreaking stories and some pretty difficult things. Um, but please feel free to share everything, because by sharing this stuff, maybe we can prevent the next generation from having to deal with it as bad. And I do hope that the situation continues to get better and that these spaces are going to be available to everybody because they belong to everybody. You know, nobody has a monopoly or a majority power um, on these things or these issues. So, yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't trade growing up gay in the country for anything. Like, I love my experience. I had a lot of privilege, obviously, because I was quite straight acting, like, especially when I was like 13 or 14. Um, and so, like, I didn't have to deal with a lot of the typical discrimination. I mean, I was bullied and people called me gay, but it wasn't like a source of huge anxiety or difficulty for me. So I realized that, and I definitely like realized the privilege that I had. Um, but that being said, I love living in the country. I love my farm life. I love my like quiet little existence. Um, but I also love visiting the city, and I love seeing my friends and going out dancing and all of that. So I don't know. There is no correct way to live. There is no this way is better than the other way. But yeah, guys, that's about it. Um, Thank you guys for watching. Please leave me your comments, your questions. Feel free to rip me apart, or if there's something I've said that you're like, no, I don't agree with that. Let me know. I'm interested. I am open. I am completely open to completely changing my worldview and the way I see everything. So, yeah. Okay, guys, I love you, and I will talk to you tomorrow.